Okay, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Lev Kubai Bahomo, and this is my individual multimedia presentation. With all of us having one life, it would make sense that we would all want to live a long and prosperous one. However, with diseases such as cancer and the constant possibility of a fatal accident, this ideal life can all of a sudden be cut short. These threats, however, all pale in comparison to the threat posed by nuclear weapons. This slideshow will explore whether or not the continued production of nuclear weapons is necessary for the security of the world. Over the years, the world has accumulated a great number of nuclear weapons. Looking at this chart, the world has over 12,500 nuclear warheads present, most of them being distributed between the US and Russia. Although this is a great improvement compared to the 60,000 nuclear warheads present during the peak of the Cold War, this is still a great threat to the world. Especially considering how since the atomic bomb has been created, scientists have also developed the hydrogen bomb, which is a lot more deadly. According to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, if a hydrogen bomb, which usually consists of 100 kilotons of TNT, was dropped on top of New York City, over 580,000 people would die immediately. Although the hydrogen bomb has not been used, the same can't be said for the atomic bomb. In 1945, the US chose to detonate the atomic bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Although this killed over 200,000 people, the US did this primarily to intimidate other countries and showcase the destructive capabilities of their newly created weapon. With a single plane now being able to level an entire city, the world was understandably thrown into a state of panic. In this state of pandemonium, however, a delicate balance between fear and security arose. As stated by Winston Churchill, the worse things get, the better. Safety will be the sturdy child of terror, and survival the twin brother of annihilation. It's clear how nuclear weapons made it so that the world's security is no longer ensured by peace, but rather by the fear and threat created by nuclear weapons. Leaders all around the world understood that diplomacy and cooperation would be key to ensuring their countries and the world's security. As stated by James Frank, a lead scientist in the creation of the atomic bomb, among all the arguments calling for an efficient international organization for peace, the existence of nuclear weapons is the most compelling one. The idea of perseverance in the face of adversity is a key ingredient to ensuring success during a crisis. Similar to the events depicted in Jacob Lawrence's painting, a group of black people are painted, shown being forced to unite and push forward even in the face of fear, which is represented by the dog. Leaders all across the world realize that no matter how chaotic or unstable the world may seem, communication and foreign diplomacy would be key. Even with the world attempting to come together, the Cold War painted a bleak picture. Over 60,000 nuclear warheads were present during the peak of the Cold War, and this led to incredibly high tensions. In 1962, the US discovered Soviet nuclear warheads in Cuba. Although negotiations began immediately, the world was on the brink of nuclear warfare for 13 days. Thankfully, however, agreements were reached. Following this crisis, the world seemingly adopted Franklin D. Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy, first introduced during the Great Depression. This policy championed respect and cooperation between foreign nations. This idea, represented in this chart, which depicts the number of treaties being passed over the years, clearly shows this kind of ideology. Clearly, countries are willing to work together with each other. They're willing to work with each other in order to avoid similar crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Over the years, America has continued to invest in the development of nuclear weapons, as demonstrated by this chart, which is given to us by the government's Congressional Budget Office. From 2023 to 2032, the U.S. is projected to spend around $247 billion in the continued development of nuclear weapons and the vehicles that house them. This support creates thousands of jobs in the nuclear industry. Looking at Sandia, a government run lab which makes components for nuclear weapons, as of 2023, 16,800 people are currently employed. The continued production of nuclear weapons clearly keeps people employed and helps ensure the stability of the US economy. Since some worry that post diplomatic failures will repeat themselves, it's understandable how some are skeptical towards the effectiveness of treaties. During a crucial time in the Cold War, the US proposed a SALT II treaty for the Soviet Union. Although the Soviet Union initially agreed, this treaty remained unratified due to the Soviet Union's breach of contract when they invaded Afghanistan. Although some countries may choose to ignore or simply breach the rules posed to them by the treaties, The majority of countries adhere to these kinds of treaties. As shown by this graph, which shows how nuclear weapons have only been decreasing over the years, um, it's clear how the world and countries in general are dedicated towards following the treaties that they have signed. The creation of nuclear weapons have developed a delicate balance between fear and security. If countries suddenly stop producing nuclear weapons, this balance can be thrown off, and the world can return to a similar sense of fear and chaos as it first experienced when the atomic bomb was detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Over the years, nations have built up trust and cooperation out of sheer necessity. Due to this, although some lack trust in foreign policy, the continued production of nuclear weapons ensures employment of thousands, constant communication between countries, and therefore the security of the world. Thank you.
Very nice job. All right. Love. Time for your oral defense questions. Okay. How did you approach and synthesize the differing perspectives in order to reach a conclusion?
Well, this topic had a lot of different perspectives. For example, I used research showcasing the destructive capabilities of nuclear weapons, which clearly shows how they're a bad and kind of really threatful weapon or creation that was introduced to the world. However, I also used research depicting how treaties have overall been extremely effective in decreasing this kind of threat, which shows the positive effects. These two conflicting perspectives I have used to kind of synthesize into my conclusion, which states that although they aren't great, these nuclear weapons aren't going anywhere. And because of that, it is necessary to continue producing them because they do ensure the security of the world in a certain way.
What additional questions emerged from your research, and why are those questions important?
A lot of the sources that I read questioned towards the end if the world, or should the world continue to develop nuclear warheads? So should they continue to make them more damaging and more kind of, I guess, dangerous? This is an important question because if it is answered and the world does agree to kind of overall stop at least advancing nuclear weapons, this can change the outlook of foreign policy for decades to come. And the balance, which was once ensured by the threat of nuclear weapons, will now have to be replaced by something different.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Nancy Olson, and I'm going to talk about implicit bias in the healthcare system. First, let's go over the agenda. First, I'm going to talk about the overall problem relevance. Next, the effects implicit bias has on patients. Then some solutions, and finally, the conclusion. Overall problem and relevance. Implicit bias is an unknowing negative attitude towards people specifically because of their race or appearance. Implicit bias is very common in healthcare and is extremely harmful. Dr. Shaven, a research professor at the University of Washington, surveyed medical students and residents and found that 50% of participants endorsed in false anti-Black stereotypes like Black people have smaller brains or less sensitive nerve endings in comparison to white people. These false stereotypes cause mistreatment toward the patient, like misdiagnoses or premature discharge, putting their health at risk. Effect on patients. Healthcare providers are more likely to mistreat their patients if they have implicit bias. The medical staff may not properly treat their patients or find the correct diagnosis because of their appearance. They may also be rude or talk to them in a condescending way. Dr. William Sim of internal medicine interviewed minority patients and asked about their experiences with healthcare facilities. With one interviewer saying, "I feel like he was trying to belittle me and my intellect." Patients feel insulted, and hospitals and other care centers may turn into places they avoid. Patient discouragement also becomes a problem. By hearing news of clinics mistreating their patients, people would rather stay ill or injured than risk being mistreated. Professor and Chair of Sports Management George Cunningham explains that members of a community, whether a city, metropolitan area, country, or even state, generally have similar social interactions, exposures to media, and collective experiences, all of which can shape their explicit and implicit bias. The collective experiences can influence how any one individual reacts to a particular situation, and therefore contextual factors likely attenuate the relationship between the bias and outcomes of the individual at individual levels. People also become fearful or gain negative viewpoints on hospitals and other care centers because of what they hear from others. This causes them to not want to get their problems checked out or treated, so their health can continue to decline because of the bad reputation hospitals may gain. Similar to Cunningham, Jonathan Ben, a research fellow at Deakin University, found that those experiencing racism had approximately 2 to 3 times the odds of reporting reduced trust in the healthcare system and professionals, lower satisfaction with healthcare services and perceived quality of care, and compromised communications and relationships with healthcare professionals. These compromised communications can be detrimental to their health and because they do not want to risk being racially profiled. To end implicit bias, it is necessary to have an effective leader bring attention to the problem. They are able to bring attention to specific hospitals and people that are racially profiling their patients. They are also able to lead and organize protests or petitions to help end implicit bias. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his inaugural address, states that only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of this moment. In this case, the dark realities is implicit bias going on in healthcare right now. Roosevelt is able to fearlessly call out the issues, which is what we need. Similarly, producer, director, and writer Melinda Janko wrote an article about Eloise Cobell. Cobell was a woman who stood up for her Indian tribal members against the United States government. Cobell was able to file a class action lawsuit against the United States Department of Interior for the mismanagement of the Indian Trust Fund belonging to over 300,000 individual members, the largest class action lawsuit ever filed against the United States. Cobell was able to bring awareness to the issue and was able to gain more rights for her community. The leaders could find a way to end businesses who are racist or fire racist workers who are against implicit bias training. And for patients who are mistreated, they could also find a way to compensate them for their poor experience. However, there are some issues with this solution. Leaders may not be able to gain a big enough following to make an impact, and some people may not change or listen to their ideas. Along with an effective leader, it is also necessary to learn about their patient's culture. If people with implicit bias were to learn the truth about their patient's culture, then stereotypes could end. As a result, white American participants who learned critical Black history reported significantly higher levels of perspective taking, which in turn was associated with significantly higher isolated and systemic racism recognition. With their awareness, they are less in denial and are more willing to make a change. It was similarly found that learning from communities is key. Indigenous communities, community healers, mutual aid groups, artists, and activists have much to teach about their health and wellness. Learning from communities, especially the ones in the neighborhood of these clinics, is crucial to creating the best services. It can be argued that implicit bias training does not work. Harvard professional Frank Dobbin states that yet 2/3 of human resource specialists report that diversity training does not have a positive effect. And several field studies found no effect on diversity training for women or minorities and managerial diversity. It will be hard to change the way people think, especially if they spent their whole lives with a racist mentality. In the end, a combination of the two solutions can be beneficial. Racist workers can learn about their patients' culture to try and end stereotypes they might have, and an effective leader can make sure changes are being made. The National Institute of Health helped prove that programmatic considerations advise organizations to consider the DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility goals, to develop evaluation plans to ensure their training attribute to these goals and key training features may be more effective at reducing implicit bias. Important training with an open mind can help people change the way they think and overall end implicit bias in healthcare. Proper implicit bias training is necessary for the healthcare system, or else hundreds of people of color will continue to die due to the mistreatment of workers. Workers need to learn about their patient's culture to end stereotypes, and effective leaders will also be able to push this issue and will benefit the communities. If implicit bias is not implemented everywhere, then people will continue to be mistreated, risking their lives.
All right, very nice, Binbin. Okay, so how did some preliminary information you gathered inform your research?
So some preliminary information I gathered before my research was that Black people had higher death rates in comparison to white people. And I was very curious as to why, which led me to implicit bias and the mistreatment.
Okay, cool. I mean, not cool, but curiosity is always cool. Let's see. What additional questions? What additional questions emerged from your research, and why are these questions important?
Some additional questions that emerged from my research was why do people have implicit bias, and like what was, if it was like from their communities, from how they've grown up, or if other factors were affecting them to have implicit bias. And I think that it's important to learn about these questions because then it could help me understand their perspective more, which could help find a solution to end implicit bias.
Very good. Okay, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Frank Diofilm, and today I'm going to be talking about my research into artificial intelligence and genetics. According to the National Human Genome Research Institute, as of 2018, 350 million people worldwide suffer from rare disorders. Of these disorders, 80% have a genetic basis, and 95% have no FDA-approved treatments. In addition, according to a study conducted by Michael Clinchy and colleagues at Western University, PTSD-like changes in the brain and behavior are not natural or maladaptive, but are rather evolutionary adaptations which entail costs such as hypervigilance, meaning that common disorders such as PTSD can have a genetic basis to them. As both rare and common disorders can have a genetic basis, a promising treatment for such disorders will likely alter or treat genes directly. Currently, the most promising treatment for gene therapy, or for genetic-based disorders, is gene therapy. Gene therapy is a technology that uses a variety of techniques and tools, such as CRISPR-Cas9, in order to alter the human genome. Being a way to edit the most fundamental building blocks of our bodies, gene therapy is a revolution in the field of medicine. However, this technology is not boundless. According to Anant Kumar and researchers at the Vellore Institute of Technology, the two major challenges in CRISPR technology are high costs and the need for more efficient GED processes. For instance, the approval of Hemgenix gene therapy for hemophilia B costs a staggering $3.5 million per treatment, making it the most expensive medication worldwide. Clearly, there is an unmet need for a tool that is able to optimize GED processes or genetic engineering data processes in order to decrease the overall cost of research for gene therapy. This tool is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has shown astounding effectiveness in many other fields of research, being able to adapt and find new solutions to many problems. Artificial intelligence, therefore, has the potential to expedite gene therapy research. But how far can it take it? Specifically, to what extent can artificial intelligence aid in the advancement of gene therapy for various disorders and illnesses? Well, one application of artificial intelligence in gene therapy is the generation of predictive AI models. According to Elham Mazzarat of Tarbiya Mudaris University, new approaches of CRISPR-Cas9 to genome editing and cancer treatment is associated with the production of a large amount of information, which is very costly to perform laboratory trials of. Artificial intelligence analyzes gene editing and more accurately by analyzing data and creating knowledge models. Essentially, AI meets the unmet need that there is to analyze large sets of data by creating predictive AI models. AI being used in this way is becoming more and more promising every single day. In fact, according to Raihan Rafiq and researchers at London University and Sejong University, the recent advancement of machine learning algorithms holds promise for the development of clinically relevant predictive models. Furthermore, more pharmacogenomic data from disease-relevant organoids and PDXs are becoming available, allowing clinical biases to be overcome. As machine learning algorithms develop, clinical use of these algorithms in gene therapy is becoming more and more feasible, allowing AI to become an even more powerful tool in gene therapy. According to Shira Poland, a scientific journalist at NYU, researchers there have created an AI program that is able to help produce customizable proteins called zinc fingers that are able to alter gene expression directly. According to their research, this AI program can model data from nearly 50 billion possible zinc finger DNA interactions, exemplifying the impact the AI can have on gene therapy. In addition to generation of predictive AI models, AI also has the ability to analyze large sets of genomic data. According to Rohit Vilkar and Alka Rawalkar of Jawaharlal Nehru Medical College, AI contributes to predicting and optimizing genome editing methods such as CRISPR-Cas9. Machine learning algorithms can analyze large-scale genetic sequence datasets, which can then be used to steer the development of more accurate and effective genome editing technologies by predicting probable off-target consequences. In order to generate predictive AI models, AI must first analyze large sets of genomic data. In addition, according to Elham Mazarat, reverse vaccine-based computer methods are used to detect and design vaccines based on the sequence information of pathogens, specific antigens, and epitopes. Some machine learning approaches for reverse vaccination include NERV, Vaxagen, GenePredict, and Vaxol. This means that machine learning algorithms are already in use. Machine learning algorithms that can analyze large sets of data are already in use in that it can accelerate the advancement of gene therapy. Now, since both gene therapy and artificial intelligence are relatively new technologies, the legality regarding the combination of the two may seem to be unclear to many. In fact, some might consider the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, which according to Megan Curl of Arizona State University, banned human germline editing in 1996. However, while this may seem to hinder research into gene therapy, in 2023, the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved two milestone treatments, Casgevy and Lyfgenia, representing the first cell-based gene therapies for the treatment of sickle cell disease in patients 12 years and older. Now, this is only the beginning. This is a major milestone in the legal development of gene therapies. In conclusion, artificial intelligence can aid in the advancement of gene therapy by optimizing database processes, such as analyzing large sets of genomic data or creating predictive AI models. Gene therapy is a field of medicine that has vast implications for both rare and common disorders, such as PTSD, meaning that the acceleration of gene therapy could be important for hundreds of millions of people worldwide.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. So, Frankie, I'm going to go ahead and ask you your questions here. How is your conclusion in conversation with the body of literature or other research sources you examined?
So the body of literature that I examined, of the majority of the sources and the body of literature that I examined were about specific applications of artificial intelligence in gene therapy. And essentially what this does for my conclusion is it provides evidence to support the fact that artificial intelligence can aid in the advancement of gene therapy research.
Okay. What information did you need that you weren't able to find or locate?
Some information that I needed that I wasn't able to necessarily access was a primary source. It was a website called deepcrispr.net, I believe. There was a link to it in a journal article that I found, and this website was essentially a primary source because it was a specific application of artificial intelligence in gene therapy, and that would have been really helpful. But unfortunately, the link didn't work. I think the website might have been taken down, and so I was not able to access it.
All right. Thank you so much. Nice job. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, my name is Stella Shepley, and for my IMP, I decided to research exposure therapy for specific phobias like acrophobia. For my presentation, I will first be giving background information and introduction to what specific phobias are, then I will be discussing the success of using exposure therapy, and then I will discuss if pharmaceuticals can be used as an alternative solution, and I will end with my conclusion. So, what are specific phobias? Katrina Honor is a fellow at Northwestern University, and her colleagues define specific phobias as, quote, a debilitating fear that restructures one's life to avoid them, which supports that it is more than a fear. Some examples of specific phobias are arachnophobia, which is fear of spiders, emetophobia, fear of vomiting, claustrophobia, fear of enclosed spaces, and aerophobia, which is fear of flying. However, for my research, I decided to focus on acrophobia, which is fear of heights. According to Verywell Health, 6% of people have acrophobia, making it one of the most common phobias. Additionally, Bethany A. Techman, who is the Director of Clinical Training at the University of Virginia, looks at the effects that acrophobia has on one's perception. In her study, all of her participants had acrophobia and were told to estimate the height of a balcony. The height of the balcony was 26 feet, but those with acrophobia estimated the height to be 42 feet, meaning that acrophobia has a great effect on one's perception. So, you may be wondering, how can phobias be treated? 2 examples of treatment are exposure therapy and pharmaceutical treatments. This led me to my research question of, is exposure therapy an effective way to treat all people with acrophobia? And my answer to this question is, although pharmaceutical treatments are less stressful than exposure therapy has been shown to be more effective in reducing symptoms of specific phobias such as acrophobia. Now, let's discuss the success of exposure therapy. Katrina Honor and her colleagues conducted a study in which participants were exposed to phobogenic images over a set period of time. She found that after 1 year, 95% of symptoms were continuing to improve, showing that exposure therapy can be very successful. Additionally, Paul M.G. Emmelkamp is a professor at the University of Amsterdam, and he used exposure therapy through VR to see how effective exposure therapy can be. He found that after using 3 sessions using VR for exposure therapy, there was significant improvement in the symptoms of specific phobias. If we look at this graph from the National Institute for Mental Health, we can see the success rates of using exposure therapy for specific phobias and for general phobias. If you see, the success rates of exposure therapy are at or above 70% for each specific phobias and for general phobias. Now, can pharmaceuticals be used as an alternative solution? Jonathan Benjamin is a researcher in South Africa, and he wanted to test if placebo or paroxetine would be effective in treating specific phobias. He found that in placebo, 1 in 6 participants responded, while in paroxetine, 3 out of 5 responded, making paroxetine very effective. It also decreases stress produced by exposure therapy. In exposure therapy, participants are being constantly exposed to their fear and their phobia, which is very anxiety-inducing. However, it is also important to discuss the negatives of using pharmaceuticals as a treatment. The side effects can be significant, and the patients can be addicted and have severe withdrawal symptoms, making the negatives outweigh the positives of using pharmaceutical treatments. Now, my conclusion. Exposure therapy should be used to treat specific phobias such as acrophobia because with consistency and time, 95% of symptoms seen in these phobias can be treated within a year. And it is without the withdrawal and becoming addicted that is prevalent in pharmaceuticals such as paroxetine. If we connect this back to one of our stimulus sources, Doris Lessing's story, Through the Tunnel, is a great example of using exposure therapy. The boy in the story is constantly exposing himself to swimming underwater through a hole in a rock. He wants to prove to himself that he can do it and stand up to the big boys in the group. And after consistency and time and doing it over and over again, he is finally able to do it, which makes it a great example of using exposure therapy for specific phobias. And that's my presentation.
Nice job.
Thank you.
I was waiting for how you were going to connect it. I like that. I like how you used it in the conclusion. All right. Stella, what additional questions emerged from your research and why are these questions important?
So one of the sources that I found super interesting was Paul M.G. Emmelkamp's using VR for exposure therapy, and it really made me wonder if there are alternative types of exposure therapy that could be used for treating specific phobias and for anxiety in general. And I think that further research is needed because I did find some alternative types. I just couldn't connect it directly back to my argument. So I think by finding these alternative methods for exposure therapy, it's important because it can reach a greater, wider patients who have various types of phobias.
How did some preliminary information you gathered inform your research?
Yeah, so originally I was going to be doing if phobias were nature versus nurture, but after doing more preliminary research, it would have been more effective to research the solutions and the therapies involved. So some preliminary research really helped me specify my argument and really lock in my research because I was able to pick a topic that had a debate to it using pharmaceuticals or exposure therapy. So the preliminary research helped me research the most common type of phobias and the most common type of therapies used in my research.
Great. Thank you. Okay. And whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, my name is Avery Buchek, and this is my multimedia presentation. As of October 26, 2023, Jim Garone reports from the U.S. Department of Defense that 900 U.S. troops were deployed into central areas of command in both Ukraine and Israel. And due to the severity of war increasing and the U.S. involvement increasing, this number has also increased. Now, what impact does this have on the soldiers that actually go to war? Well, according to the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, in 2023, there was prevalence of lifetime war zone-related PTSD in 17% of male veterans and 15% of women veterans. So, you might be wondering, well, what is PTSD? Well, according to Mayo Clinic, a nonprofit American medical center, they classify the term as a mental health condition that's triggered by a terrifying event, either witnessing it or experiencing it. So, in order to fully understand the effects that PTSD has on people, we must first look at the effects that it has on animals. In a study led by Liana Zanet, a biology professor at Western University, they found the effects of PTSD on these animals, saying more than just a fight or flight reaction, and instead can produce long-lasting effects that are likely to affect fecundity and survival. In order to relate this to humans, a study done by the Disabled American Veterans Organization explains the symptoms of PTSD in veterans, saying veterans with signs of PTSD may also find it difficult to sleep, relax, be prone to anger or irritability, startle easily, act recklessly, abuse drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism, and so on. So, clearly, the effects of PTSD are not only long-lasting, but also detrimental when it comes to day-to-day living in veterans. Well, now you might be wondering, what works? And more importantly, what is FDA approved? Some commonly used treatments are SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And since these are, I don't know why it looks like that. Anyways, SSRIs are one of the main and most common treatments. And when I was researching what would work quicker and more effective due to the increase of soldiers going to war, I came across clinical trials with psychedelics. And so this raised my question of, should psychedelics such as methylene deoxyphetamine, such as MDMA, be a part of the treatment of U.S. veterans with PTSD? And my answer to this question is, although psychedelics are extremely expensive, the use of MDMA has the ability to reverse changes in the brain caused by PTSD and greatly reduces the symptoms that are also caused by PTSD. First, we must address, obviously, the counterargument, which is the expenses of MDMA. Elliot Marcelli, a professor of psychedelic science economics at the University of California, explains how MDMA, as conducted in a phase 3 trial, costs $11,000 per patient. This is expensive compared to SSRIs, which on average with public health insurance, Rebecca Arsback and Roy Signetti explain, around $55 per month supply. If additional therapy is required, Catherine Learmouche explains, on average, with OK Insurance, it costs around $2,000 per year. Combining this with the SSRI medication cost, it would be around $2,758. For most, this seems like a more reasonable option. However, the benefits greatly outweigh the costs. The first benefit I will be going over is how MDMA affects the brain. PTSD affects the neural networks and emotional portions of the brain, specifically the amygdala and hippocampus. As previously said, some of the symptoms regarding PTSD are irritation and anger, as well as flashbacks, which are directly related to the amygdala and hippocampus. Parker Singleton, a professor of computational biology at Cornell University, explains the difference in the brain after using MDMA. He says the amount of increased right amygdala and left hippocampal RSFC after MDMA positively correlated with PTSD symptoms improvement at a near significant level. So, the significant changes in the brain can also lead to significant physical changes in the symptoms. So now, let's go over these symptom reductions. Aaron Credit, who works in the Department of Psychiatry at Leiden University Medical Center, explains, after 2 MDMA sessions, 54.2% of patients no longer met PTSD diagnostic criteria, compared with 22.6% with the control group. So now, what does this all mean with veterans? Well, as previously said, 17% of male veterans have PTSD and 15% in women. So, if around 50% of these veterans no longer met the diagnostic criteria, there would only be around 8.5% of male veterans and 17.7% of female veterans with PTSD. So, in conclusion, with the chemical changes in the brain, this allows for post-traumatic growth, which also allows for the reduction of symptoms and positive changes in the brain as well. There is not much a single person can do to change the number of troops going to war. That is really up to the government. But there is a way to help the veterans and soldiers when they get back. And this answer is psychedelic assisted therapy. And here are my sources.
Very nice. Thank you very much. All right, Avery. What are the implications of your findings to your community?
So originally I thought about this question and I realized that my grandpa is actually a U.S. veteran. So I went and talked to him and realized, and he explained to me that a lot of his friends and former colleagues actually have PTSD, and I was very curious, which also led to this project, on how to actually help them and see if there's a more faster and more effective way to treat them.
Nice. All right. Did your research go in a different direction than you originally expected? If so, how? Or if not, why not?
Yeah, so actually with my research and specifically, I really wanted to focus on psychedelics as a whole, but then I realized there are several different portions of psychedelics that are being clinically trialed to treat PTSD, including ketamine, traditional psychedelics such as mushrooms, and then, of course, MDMA. So I decided to focus on MDMA because it had the most research behind it.
All right. Thank you so much. Good work. And okay. When you're ready, you can start.
All right. Hi, I'm Lincoln Lundak, and today I'll be talking about logging's effect on wildfire.
Sorry. Let's try it one more time. Try one more time.
All right. Should I start from the top?
You can, yeah.
Okay.
Just can you click just to make sure? No. You're clicking. You gotta click the arrow.
Oh.
There we go. Okay. Go ahead.
All right. I'm Lincoln Lundak, and today I'll be talking about logging's effect on wildfire. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, since the 1980s, there's been a rise in the prevalence and severity of wildfire, specifically in California. And my research question was, to what extent does logging industry practices impact areas prone to wildfires and those residing there? Today we'll first be talking about what the issue is, then we'll be talking about my position, my counter-argument, a refutation of that counter-argument, and my conclusion. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, since the 1980s, wildfire has been on the rise, specifically in areas like California and Colorado. A major issue that has arisen from recent wildfires is the wildfire smoke's impact on people's health. According to A.G. Rappold, a researcher known for her work with the Environmental Protection Agency, wildfire smoke has been shown to cause raised hospitalizations, asthma, and heart failure. At the same time, according to Richard Haynes at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. timber harvest has risen over 67% since 1971, and over the last 50 years, logging has coincided with the raising wildfires. With the logging industry coinciding with the rising wildfire and serious health implications that the wildfires carry, the logging industry holds the blame. The fight against largely profitable logging industries requires moral courage and leadership similar to those depicted in Jacob Lawrence's Confrontation on the Bridge. Although other factors may also be responsible for wildfires, the logging industry's practice of planting monocultures and the infrastructure required to log are accountable for wildfire severity and prevalence. A major impact that logging has on forest ecosystems is in biodiversity. According to Simon Thorne and his colleagues at the Würzburg University of Germany, salvage logging, a logging practice where they try to salvage profit from wildfires, destroyed biodiversity in most cases. This is important because at the same time, according to Kendall L. Calhoun at the University of California, Berkeley, forests with less biodiversity have been shown to have greater risk for wildfire. Another major impact that that logging has on wildfire is on ignition points. According to Alexander Safard at the University of Wisconsin, expansion of development into wildland vegetation causes greater wildfire damage due to increased ignition points. At the same time, according to Frederick Ackard at the EU Commission of Environmental Protection, the increased ignition points in logged areas cause greater risk of wildfire, showing how logging infrastructure creates increased ignition points and how increased ignition points create greater risk for wildfire. According to Franco Turco at the University of Murcia, Spain, climate change is also responsible for wildfire. Climate change is a large factor in the uptake of wildfire, wildfire, with between 1971 and 2022, there has been a 172% increase in burned areas caused by climate change. However, according to Jonathan R. Thompson at the Oregon State University, logging-related altercations in stand structure can increase both the risk of occurrence and impact of subsequent wildfires through changes in fuel types and conditions, showing how, while climate change is a large factor in wildfire, it is not the only factor. And then here's my conclusion, which is that overall, logging practices tend to neglect the risk of wildfires in the name of profit. And this comes in the form of cutting corners around biodiversity standards, destroying stand structure of forests, forests, which ends up impacting the families of people who have health altercations because of wildfire.
All right. Thank you very much, Lincoln. Nice work. What information did you need that you weren't able to find or locate?
A major one was there wasn't a lot of studies directly looking at logging industry and having that be a the variable that was being changed, and wildfire being the independent variable. It was trying, a lot of the times it was more about logging impact on biodiversity, logging impact on people living there, but not directly on wildfire. So that was a big thing that I was missing.
Okay. How did you use the conclusions or questions of others to advance your own research?
This was something that I used a lot, and a lot of the conclusions that I found were talking about needing more research, which was not really helpful to me. But a big thing in other people's conclusions that was helpful was that they noted that most of the logging corporations were valuing profit over the impact that they actually had on forests and wildfires, which was really influenced the conclusions that I had in my presentation and my paper.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice. Okay, go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Zoe Feegis, and today I'll be discussing the effectiveness of protest tactics in convincing politicians that reform to abortion laws need to be changed. The points I'll be discussing today are: what is the issue, the question I've formulated, my proposed solution, before diving deeper into the proposed solution, discussing the violent protest tactics, more effective protest tactics, and my conclusion. First, what is the issue? Abortion rights are one of the most highly discussed topics in the United States today and can be very dangerous for many and affect hundreds of thousands of women in the United States. Restrictions can lead to dangerous circumstances physically and financially for many women. According to Kristen Bippins, a researcher at the University of Bern, Republican legislators have passed over 60 laws restricting abortion after proposing over 500. This demonstrates the extent to which abortion rights are currently being restricted and how many women are going to suffer over time as they don't have access to these abortions, and it could result in dangerous situations. The question I came up with are: what are the most effective tactics abortion right activists can utilize to convince political leaders that reform to abortion rights needs to be expanded? After researching, my proposed solution is that while violent tactics often receive extensive media coverage, nonviolent protests and social media are more effective tactics in convincing political leaders that abortion rights needs to be expanded. First, I'm going to discuss violent tactics. Violent tactics include burning buildings, breaking into buildings, and any violent marches. Although these receive media coverage due to causing large discourse in communities, they aren't necessarily effective. Many times they are misrepresentative of the issue at hand and can deter people from supporting the cause. For example, in an article from the Washington Post, after one violent Black Lives Matter movement, people began to compare it to the insurrection on the Capitol of January 6, 2021. This is dangerous because because it misrepresented the Black Lives Matter movement and shed a light on the movement that was not right. This deterred many people from helping the cause and pushed back on helping reduce police brutality. Instead, I propose abortion right activists utilize effective tactics such as social media and peaceful protests. Peaceful protests include any peaceful marches, sit-ins, and walkouts. These can be even more representative of the issue at hand and more effective. According to Eric Schumann, a postdoc fellow at New York University, peaceful protests have proven to gain support from resistant audiences, which are typically white males. This could be extremely helpful for abortion rights activists, as many of the people they are trying to convince are white Republican legislators. A prime example of a successful peaceful protest is Eloise Cobell. Cobell was fighting for Native American rights, and after gaining support from her fellow Navajo tribe members, she was able to receive a court date and eventually win equal rights for all Native American people. Without the support from her fellow tribe members, she might have been unable to secure a court date, and we might still be struggling with severe discrimination against Native Americans. Another example is the civil rights movement. In his painting, Confrontation at the Bridge, Jacob Lawrence depicts a group of African Americans marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, aiming to reach Montgomery, Alabama, in solidarity with the rest of the civil rights movement. They faced extreme massacre and violence from police, however, they returned to the bridge 3 times to finally reach Montgomery, Alabama. Their perseverance and strength helped properly represent the fight for civil rights, and although it didn't directly induce the passing of the Civil Rights Act, it helped gain support from white audience members and helped promote the cause in order to reach this point. Another tactic would be utilizing social media. Social media is ever growing in the world today, and many young adults already use it as a way to access news. Although there are some restrictions to social media. Many older adults can be resistant to social media's effect. According to Nura Kara, a digital citizenship researcher, 18% of students at a private university disagree with social media's effectiveness in creating political change. This demonstrates that a small population of young adults already disagree with social media's resistance, which could be even more applied to older adults who are resistant, who aren't necessarily as technologically savvy and might be more resistant to social media. However, there is a large population that already uses social media. In the same study, Kara found that 64% of students at the same university already belong to online groups involved in political and social change, demonstrating that many people already use social media to be active citizens and politically active. This could be helpful for abortion rights activists as they could reach younger audiences and, if used properly, could help reach older audiences. Additionally, social media can be used as a call to action. In her article, Bivens mentions after the proposal of a Georgia bill aiming to criminalize miscarriage, a viral post of social media went around calling women to send their used tampons to their state legislators. Although this is an extreme example, abortion rights activists could use similar tactics to organize nationwide protests or even just spread news about the current legislation. This could be extremely useful as it could help spread word of the cause and help promote support. In conclusion, I propose that abortion rights activists utilize effective tactics such as social media and peaceful protests over violent tactics in order to properly represent the issue and gain support from resistant audiences. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Zoe. Let's see here. What are the implications of your findings to your community?
Oak Park and River Forest is a very largely Democratic area, and many people here support abortion rights. So I think if we were able to apply it to the community, we could organize peaceful protests or create a social media account in promoting abortion that could help spread word around the community of how to support legislators that promote abortion rights.
How did some preliminary information you gathered inform your research?
When I was gathering my preliminary information, I found a specific article from The Guardian that discussed one specific protest that happened in New York, and it included like marchees' testimonials during the march. And they were talking about, and there's also one from Kamala Harris who was talking about that if we unite people together in these peaceful protests, it can demonstrate to political leaders that the strength of the support and that a lot of people want it to happen, which is more likely to convince them. And I found this really interesting since it was coming from a political leader herself who's now the vice president, and that peaceful protest is an effective tactic, which I then included in my proposed solution.
All right. Thank you very much. Good job. Okay.
Hello, I'm Elijah Stevens, and today I will be focusing on how to minimize the effects of pressure put on athletes. First, I will be starting off by describing what is the body's natural response to stress. After that, I will be looking at different pressures that athletes face. Then I will be looking at how these different pressures affect athletes. Then that will bring me to my solution, and finally I will conclude with my conclusion. This first was looked at in 1908 by psychiatrists Robert M. Yerkes and John Dillingham Dodson, who created the Yerkes-Dodson law, which simply put states that as your arousal or enjoyment in a task increases, so does your ability to perform in that task up to a certain extent. This would then be refined in 1979 by British cardiologist Dr. Peter Nixon, who created the human function curve, which shows that as your stress in a performance increases, it also increases your performance, but up to a certain extent. Once you reach your max point, then the more stress that you have will end up lowering your performance. So, what are different pressures? The two pressures that I'll be focusing on is the pressure to win and the pressure to provide. First, the pressure to win. Sports in itself are a competition. In every single game, someone must lose and someone must win. Because of this, athletes will work their whole lives to try and become the team that will win. There's also the pressure to provide. Being in sports from a young age forces students and young athletes to often look for athletic scholarships rather than academic scholarships. Because of this, it puts them in a risky situation where if they don't get an athletic scholarship, they risk not being able to afford or go to college as a whole. According to the NCAA, only 2% of high school athletes will be able to receive an athletic scholarship for their sport. Of these 2% who are lucky enough to make it to the collegiate level, only 2% of those will go on to play professionally in their respective sport. What are some of the effects of these pressures that are put on athletes? The first effect was felt firsthand by Simone Biles, where in the 2020 Olympics, the most winning gymnast of all time decided to withdraw in the middle of the games because she said, quote, "I just don't trust myself as much as I used to, and no, the mental is not there." Because of the stress and pressure that was put on Simone to perform again and again and again, it ended up pushing her past her breaking point to a point where she decided to not compete anymore at all. But this is not the case for all athletes. Billie Jean King, one of the greatest tennis players of all time and LGBTQ rights activist, lived and built her whole career off performing in the pressure. In an interview with the Washington Post, she coined her phrase, quote, "Pressure is a privilege, and it only comes to those who earn it." Every single time that Billie Jean King stepped on the court, she used that pressure to try and propel her to a higher level. So this brings me to my solution. My solution is that coaches can provide pressure to their players in practice. This is a controlled environment where they can provide a certain amount of pressure in a certain amount of ways that best benefits their selected group of athletes. It is the coach's responsibility to make sure that they do the best that they can to try and help their athletes. This includes physically and as well as mentally. And coaches who support their athletes mentally are also supporting them physically. So what is pressure training? Some examples of pressure training are high-stakes practices, game-like situations, and rewarding winning. All of these situations make coaches and athletes feel more prepared in practice, and by the time that they get to game, they feel less stress or pressure to perform in the games because they have already practiced it. What are some of the outcomes of pressure training? A 2023 study by the International Athletes and Pressure Training by the Journal of Applied Sports Psychologists said that, quote, PT, pressure training, enhances performance by providing athletes a chance to practice coping skills and realize that pressure does not have to hurt their performances. So in conclusion, the amount of stress that athletes face will at some point affect their performance. And there are different things and different pressures that will end up affecting athletes, but there are also different ways, like pressure training, that coaches can use to try and lower this amount of pressure that athletes face.
All right. Great.
These are my references.
All right. Thank you so much, Elijah. All right. So now let's see here. How did you use the conclusions or questions of others to advance your own research?
Because the human function chart is binomial, meaning there's like two different sides where pressure helps you increase and pressure helps you decrease. there are a lot of opinions saying that if you add more pressure, it'll help, but adding too much pressure also makes them perform worse. So I decided to look for a middle ground, which combines both adding pressure while not using too much pressure to reach your peak performance.
Okay. Did your research go in a different direction than you originally expected?
Yes, first I wanted to look at how different fans pressure athletes and how these will affect them in bigger games. But because that's such a hard thing to quantify and like actually see how it affects in-game situations rather than ones where there isn't pressure, it's hard to find any evidence on that. So I decided to shift more to overall pressure as a whole of being an athlete.
Okay. All right. Very good. Thank you so much. Okay, go ahead.
All right. I'm sorry, should I be looking at the camera or you?
I don't care.
All right. I'm Michael, and I chose to do a position-based argument based on whether or not people who are suffering from mental disorders should self-isolate or use traditional therapy to help themselves. So what is self-isolation? So self-isolation is either unconscious or conscious separation from others, whether you're sitting in a room, you're sitting outside. It's a place where you are away from a crowd or from any individual whatsoever. It is usually caused because the brain has a lot of pressure from strong emotions or past experiences. Causes that are more specific would be societal pressuring, a fear of failure, being like, I'm not good enough to do this, I'm worried about how this is going to turn out for me, a job application, something going on in school. It can be caused by previous depressive symptoms, it can be caused by an anxiety disorder, it can also be caused by sleep deprivation. Whether or not you are separating because it's something specific or you just don't feel like you want to interact with other people, it all leads to self-isolation where you are, for either days at a time or a long period of time during a day, completely separated from other people. So a study from Xu, a medical researcher at the National Institute of Medicine, said that in a study done with over 400 applicants, an age range of 3 years old to 47 years old, that children do not naturally self-isolate. And it's actually a learned behavior because it was only identified in young adults, being those 15 and older, and adults being those 20 and older. And it's shown that we are a naturally tribal species. We go to others for help naturally, but because of the way that society is oriented in a modern age, we do not learn. We learn that we have to try to deal with our problems on our own by usually the age of 12 or 13. What is traditional therapy? So when you think of traditional therapy, you're probably thinking of psychotherapy, which is where you're sitting on a bench, you're talking to a therapist like it's a movie, and you're sitting there and you're talking about a specific emotion or a specific event in your past life or a current event, and you're trying to deal with any kind of mental affliction, whether it be specifically a depressive disorder, or it can be an anxiety syndrome disorder, or it can be suicidal thoughts, or sleep deprivation help. And also there is natural social outreach where you are in a group of friends, you're talking to one of your friends one-on-one, a family member. It's just known as natural therapy where you're trying to open up to someone close to you that you trust. So the benefits of therapy are that traditional therapy allows you to confront problems head on. And unlike with self-isolation where you're away from other people and your brain is trying to get rid of the pressure by literally taking everything out of the equation by sitting in a room by yourself, not dealing with any problem head on. Traditional therapy allows you to confront problems, whether it be just through talking it out with someone and trying to get more advice, or just venting to someone to try to get the pressure off of you. A quote from Yanguas, a writer from the PubMed Central who interviewed over 7 different experts on mental afflictions, who did multiple years of research, is that therapy allows for a safe space that individuals can unbottle emotions and can learn to deal with overarching mental conditions, whether it be mental condition that you're born with, a mental condition that happened because of an event previously, or just something you're dealing with right now. So for the negative effects of self-isolation, there are development of or worsening of depressive symptoms due to the fact that when you are not interacting with people on a daily basis and you are just alone in a room, your brain is not put into a good state of mind. You are put into fight or flight. And due to the fact that you're not used to dealing with any social isolation naturally, your brain is going to go into fight mode due to the fact that you're afraid of whatever is going to happen to you, like whether like pressure from, like I said previously, a job application or from school. And it leads to depressive symptoms because you're not dealing with it head on, and insomnia and sleep disruption because of the fact that you are, again, developing depressive symptoms, which leads to sleep disruption, or other way around, because you're not interacting with people, or you're not getting outside, or you're not dealing with any of your problems. You're staying up later because your brain's natural circadian rhythm is messed up, or your natural sleep structures are messed up, and it leads to depressive symptoms. Another quote from Yanguas is that, backing up what I just said, self-isolation causes harm to natural sleep disruptors and leads to depressive symptoms, again, due to the fact that you are not dealing with any of your problems and you're bottling it up, dealing with a lot of pressure in your head. Also, I want to focus on the anxiety disorders. I previously had just said that about 2 slides ago where I said your brain goes into fight or flight mode, but there are times when self-isolation has to end. You have to go outside for something, and because your brain is not used to being in any social situation, it'll immediately go into hyperadrenaline mode because you aren't dealing with any of your problems and you're afraid of the pressure of what's going on or a consequence of what's going on. A quote from Janet Arbuckle, a researcher at DePaul University who has spent over 9 years researching into self-isolation behaviors, says that isolation can have significant negative effects on mental health, including increased use of depression, anxiety, and risk of suicide. I had already talked about depression and anxiety, but the risk of suicide comes from the mixture of depressive symptoms and anxiety disorders, and it leads to a very negative mental space. And also because you aren't getting any help from others and you're not getting any social outreach to others, people don't know what you're going through, that you're not going to get any help unless you deal with it, and it leads to natural suicidal thoughts. So some people may argue that because there is some short-term support for self-isolation, it can be used positively. But the only study I found backing this up was one where there were 70 people, and for 3 days monitored, they were kept in self-isolation rooms, and 40% of them said they felt less stress on a daily basis. The problem with this is it's not real self-isolation because you're being monitored, and also is only for a period of 3 days. Here's the problem. After that 3-day segment, after about a week segment, anxiety gets worse because of the sleep disorders or because of your natural fight or flight responses. And the thing is that natural therapy helps with long-term because you are confronting problems head-on, and it leads to a lower sense of anxiety because of the fact that problems are dealt with, you are able to outreach to others, and you have a greater goal of recovery over time, and you're not bottling up emotions and dealing with long-term anxiety. A quote from Thaler, a researcher at the Tulane University at School of Public Health, is that adaptation to natural and healthy ways of expressing emotions allows for better long-term effects for individuals. So I took 2 perspectives for this presentation. For the ethical perspective, there are some who would say that you can't interfere with self-isolation because it's an individual's choice to self-isolate. They have freedoms, they're allowed to do that. Here's the problem. It leads to depressive symptoms. It leads to anxiety disorders. It leads to worsened sleep health, and it leads to suicidal thoughts. So I think as an ethical question, you have to step in to help people. Whether or not you know that someone is unconsciously doing it or consciously doing it, your friend that says, I'm not going out tonight, I think I'm just going to stay home for a few days, you have to instigate, you have to stop them from doing this because of what happens long term. I also chose cultural because we do this as a society. As I had said way back when in the presentation, it happens when you're about 12 or 13 where you learn through societal conditioning that you are supposedly supposed to deal with problems head on. It makes you more of an adult, it makes you more mature. We need to stop this as a culture. We need to step in as a culture and say to each other, we have to recognize when we're doing this as an individual. We have to recognize when we're doing this unconsciously or consciously, and we have to stop others from doing this, people close to us from doing this, and we have to tell them to confront their problems head on. And here are my sources.
All right. Thank you very much. Stop that timer so it doesn't beep at us. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you the oral defense questions now, Michael. How did you approach and synthesize the differing perspectives in order to reach a conclusion?
So at first, when I saw that there were 2 perspectives, I was actually kind of shocked. I didn't think there was going to be any mental health professional that would actually support self-isolation. I only found 1 study, and there were 2 names that kept coming up. One person was called Rentz, and one person was called I'm blanking right now. But they were supposedly saying that if it's monitored, it can be beneficial, but the majority of what I saw was that people were very against self-isolation. So I took the points from the 2 people. I took the points of monitored, everything's good in moderation. I took that perspective from it, but I mostly dealt with the overarching long-term goals. I mostly dealt with people being it's not good in the long term. So that's what most of my presentation was about. It was introducing self-isolation and some support for it, but most of my points were counter arguments for it.
And then, what additional questions emerged from your research, and why are these questions important?
One additional question that emerged from my research was, I was originally thinking that I was going to hear a lot more about addiction problems, but I only found 1 study done on how self-isolation affects addiction, and it was really negative, but I only found, again, 1 study, and I didn't feel like I could add it to my presentation because I didn't find a lot of support for it. A question that came up to me was, why are there not more studies done on the effects of addiction on self-isolation? But I think what the study showed me was that addiction leads to self-isolation, not the other way around. So that's why I feel like that question was answered. If I was doing a presentation on addiction, I would have had a smaller slide on self-isolation, not addiction on a self-isolation presentation.
All right. Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Duke Walsh, and today I've done my individual multimedia presentation on athletic departments and their role in sustaining the mental and physical health of our student athletes. So this is our agenda for today, but since we have a lot to go through, I'm just going to get right into the presentation. And here's our first section. We're going to go to the introduction of our problem. So collegiate and high school athletics are a way of the student life and really the life of the public. College athletics are televised on television. You can hear them on the radio. High school athletics are part of the student experience for students. They'll go to a football game or they'll go to a basketball game throughout their high school career. So what needs to be done to make sure that the mental health and the physical health from these pressures are not too much for our student athletes? Well, every coach in our athletic departments and our athletic directors and coordinators need to know what kind of pressures, just from joining a sport, they're putting, like how much pressure they're putting on their shoulders. Sorry, I just went to the next one for some reason. And we also want to, and since these practices are getting better, but there's still more work that needs to be done. So good mental health practices in our athletic departments equals good understanding of why their physical health is so important. So good mental health practices in a program, when a player gets injured, for example, they'll know what their body needs to recover. They won't stress their body. They're going to let it relax and let themselves heal. They'll have support from staff, whether that be trainers or coaches, and it promotes positive team adversity, which we'll get more to later. And then poor looks like rushed recovery process. It promotes unhealthy practices. You'll practice or play whilst injured, and the staff are focused on the improvement of the team's performance and not on the recovery process. So let's go to our next session of the stresses on student athletes. So being a student athlete is basically having a full-time unpaid job. So student athletes can put an additional 40 hours of work just from putting on a student athlete performance, just from practicing, just from playing the game, and just from training. This can cause anxiety and stress to our student athletes in high school and collegiate athletics. So this is a quote from Ken Chu and Ron Thompson from Indiana State University and Indiana University in the book published by the NCAA, Mind, Body, and Sport. Students who seek counseling services generally have a higher % chance in graduating than those who never seek counseling. And this, of course, goes on with our student athletes as well in most of these cases. And for Power 5 collegiate student athletes, the media is also another big attention grabber, whether it be College Game Day, you see ESPN there, you see these big media companies televising their game, and also social media is a big stressor for student athletes as well. Next section will be our necessity in having trusted resources in athletic departments. So injuries will forever be a part of athletics. You cannot get around them. So what is done in a program really shapes how that experience is going to go for all of the student athletes, not just the student athlete that is injured. So as you can see, most of them are usually wanting to go out there and play the game, but there are also problematic situations where I will state next, where student athletes will restrict their caloric intake because they don't feel that they are allowed to eat because they're injured and they don't play. And this is a quote directly from Margot Pudikin, the director of athletic medicine and the head physician at Princeton University. This is also in the book, Mind, Body, and Sport, published by the NCAA. And we also want to praise professional athletes that withdraw themselves because of these issues. So Simone Biles in the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, she withdrew herself from the final in gymnastics because she was sustaining an injury, making it known for other athletes, especially student athletes, that physical health does come first. And with positive mental health practices in these programs with coaches and athletic departments, we can better the physical health of our student athletes as well. So resources for student athletes will be coaches, social workers, athletic coordinators and directors, and if applicable, sports psychologists. So having these good resources, especially coaches, because coaches are the number one resource of our student athletes. They're the people that they will go to in the first glance. So they need to be trained on knowing what student athletes are going through normally, and that being a student athlete along with a student is a huge commitment for someone of that age. Our next section will be best practices for our coaches and athletic departments. So back to adversity. Promoting positive adversity in a program is a very impactful thing. So adversity is basically, there's a big wall of challenges. And what we want to do in our athletic departments and in our athletic programs is we want to help our student athletes overcome these challenges. But however, when it gets too much, whether you're which these guys are a full-time student, it can get to be too much and they can start to break down. And this is what we want to find, that balance in them overcoming this adversity, but still doing it in a way that isn't harmful. So findings also suggest, this is from Linda K. Manning, who is the co-founder in Circle of Life Counseling. She says that findings suggest that dealing with adversity, later in life requires this substantial internal and external resources. So again, knowing the mental toughness and having the resources to get through them. So what needs to change? What has been happening is coaches and even doctors have been warned that feigning an injury is shameful and worthy of contempt. And this cannot happen in any way, shape, or form for student athletes, because they'll just playing on an injury even betters their chances of never playing their sport again due to that injury. And then what should be happening, the alternative, is acknowledging, treating, and ultimately preventing the routine hazards associated with football and really any other sport, but this one was talking about football, to undermine the current system that is worthy of contempt of talking about injuries. And these two quotes are from Kathleen Brzezinski from Muhlenberg College. And athletic departments should be spending more on mental health resources. That might require changing where other funding is going. Make resources known. Make sure that the student athletes know that there are social workers there and that they're there for them, and acknowledge the challenges. So here's our final thought slide. We need to remember that student athletes are there to play a game. They're there to get a degree and ultimately be a student, learn life lessons through sports, and what's the point in joining a sport if to not have fun? And that's really the biggest point of all. That's my reference. Thank you. And we will go to our oral defense questions.
All right. Very nice. Finished just in the nick of time there. All right, Duke, let's see here. Let's see. What are the implications of your findings to your community?
So in the OPRF community, we have actually a sports psychologist that actually kind of jump-started my research and interest in this presentation today. His name is Jonathan Mamie at OPRF, and he's an intern here as a sports psychologist. And I actually wrote an article about him in our trapeze, but that's not important. But the implications are, this is a real thing. Professional athletes and student athletes usually have their mental health, it doesn't matter. Or that they're coming up into these crowds of hundreds of people and playing a sport with high expectations. And so there needs to be more views and more people coming into this field.
Let's see here. How did your research question evolve as you moved through the research process?
Yeah, so my research question, obviously, it starts really broad. I wanted to go somewhere in athletics. And then I met our sports psychologist. I thought, well, sports psychology is a little bit more narrow, but I wanted to make sure that I encompass something grander, whether it just be like our programs and our athletic departments. But then I found that if I include both, it's not too much. So, because there's a lot of similarities. So it didn't really evolve into like a big switcheroo, but I was able to narrow it more and more and more.
All right. Thank you very much. Nice job. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Dominic Parsi, and I chose for my IMP, I chose the courage of moral courage, and yeah, let's begin. So, how does moral courage impact ethics? That was the question that I seek to answer in my presentation, and yeah, let's continue. So, my overall thesis was moral courage results in stronger ethical principles that incentivize ethical behavior within groups. So, this can be shown through history, philosophy, ethics, and social organizations. Now, with this, what is moral courage? Why should we care about this? Moral courage is the ability to stand up for and practice to which one considers ethical, even when faced with a dilemma. So this could be, for example, bullying, peer pressure, or disobeying an order that is wrong. Now, continuing on now to our historical center, Stanislav Petrov, who was a Soviet Union officer in 1983, he's known for disobeying by not reporting a direct false alarm to his superiors, which basically means that there was a false alarm for a nuclear strike that the U.S. attacked on the Soviet Union, and he chose not to give out that order to attack back, basically. And this intelligent disobedience against his direct given duties was a huge example of moral courage in history and caused millions, possibly billions of lives to not be changed through his act of moral courage. Now, continuing on throughout history, we can go to Greek history and bioethics. So bioethics is the ethics of medical and biomedical research. So, for example, a bioethical professor, if a doctor comes in with a consult, the bioethical professor will basically be asked, what is my best course to make this procedure ethical? So, for example, if somebody wants to live, or say the patient wants to die, and the family wants the patient to keep living, that's when a biomedical or bioethical individual would come in and then give their opinion on the situation. Now, according to Anna B. Hamrick, who is a retired professor and formerly the Associate Dean for Academic Programs at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Nursing, Greeks' emphasis on developments of good character bioethics with some notable expectations. This shows a direct connection between Greeks and Greek history with bioethics and also moral courage. Now, continuing on this, we're going to go to the philosophy. Philosophy is incredibly important to the topic of moral courage because one of the huge topics of philosophy is how do we know what something is right and something is wrong? So, according to Ted Thomas, who's the director of the Department of Command and Leadership in the U.S. Army, the critical application of moral courage is knowing when and how to disobey, which can be thought of as intelligent disobedience. This intelligent disobedience topic comes up earlier in our argument, which comes up with Stanislav Petrov. Intelligent disobedience is basically when an individual acts against orders in order to preserve ethical prosperity. So, for example, if an order is given out to harm innocent civilians or to harm innocents at all, an individual who has moral courage will act and will choose to disobey these orders. Now this brings us to the social side. And moral courage is a crucial concept, basically, in healthcare and in nurse practitioners. So this means that, for example, nursing and social constructs such as healthcare are extremely important in keeping moral courage as the foundation of it. Without moral courage as the foundation of nursing, of healthcare, there would not be an ethical background to all of these factors and all these jobs that need to have ethics in them. Now, continuing on to ethics, workplaces such as nurse practitioners, the foundation of them is moral courage. So without moral courage and without ethics or without intelligent disobedience, they would not be able to take care of a patient ethically, and they would be unable then to make an ethical decision for that patient. Now, continuing on this to a limitation, According to Joseph L. Jordan, punishments can range from a simple reprimand or forfeiture of pay and allowances to confinement for up to 2 years in dishonorable discharge for moral courage, actually. Disobeying an order against the US government can result in up to 2 years of prison time. That's incredibly important to understand because it means that moral courage is actually being confined in military spaces and that it's being restricted. And without moral courage in these areas, that can cause serious problems. Oftentimes, moral courage is better done than doing nothing at all. According to Ted Thomas, as stated before, intelligent disobedience requires refusing to follow orders that are either unlawful or produce harm. While this takes courage to do so, failure to act on that courage often does more damage to a career and life than the risk of not doing anything. This is extremely important to remember because it means that moral courage is often better than doing nothing at all. Moral courage also shows that this also then goes over to our conclusion slide, where moral courage also causes ethical principles to be more apparent in social backgrounds and also in ethical areas, which also incentivizes more ethical behavior. These were the bibliography, and yeah.
All right. Hard part's over.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask you a couple questions. How is your conclusion in conversation with the body of literature or other research sources you examined?
So from Ted Thomas, actually, that conclusion of kind of how moral courage is you're better off using moral courage than doing nothing at all. That really impacted kind of my conclusion. It really, I wanted to use that as my conclusion almost, but I really also wanted to use it in conversation with another conclusion, which was that moral courage is so impactful on environments such as healthcare and all that, that it really helped kind of form my conclusion of moral courage really does help incentivize these ethical principles in these areas.
Okay. Thank you for that. What evidence did you gather that you didn't include, and why did you choose not to include it?
So there was a statistic that I found about nurses having more moral courage than regular individuals or the average individual. And I found that the study was unreliable when I fact-checked it with a bunch of other studies. But then I did find something from PubMed research that did help answer that. But then I just felt it was too late to include the scientific lens into my paper.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. When you're ready.
All right. Hi, I'm Molly Castle, and my topic question is, should teens change their sleep habits in order to improve their overall health? In researching the topic of teens and sleep habits, I learned many statistics that showed me how important sleep is to a person's health. And the research shows that teens do not get enough sleep. Some of it is our fault. We lay in bed looking at our phones, we procrastinate to the last minute, resulting in staying up all night, and we drink energy drinks full of caffeine. This is so common that 33% of Americans do not get enough sleep. That number increased to 97% when researchers looked at teens and their sleep habits, and the health consequences are staggering. 200% increased risk of cardiovascular disease just from not getting enough sleep. Sleep is critical to being mentally and physically healthy, and especially important to teens. During this presentation, I'm going to talk through what the research says about the importance of sleep. I'll then discuss my position on changing sleep habits. I have a possible solution that I'll share and discuss some of the limitations to that solution. And finally, I will share my response to those limitations and why I stand behind my argument that teens should change their sleep habits. Doing so will make them more physically and mentally healthy throughout their lives. Lack of sleep is scientifically proven to increase the likelihood of significant health problems later in life. We learned from an article about moral courage and intelligent disobedience that cultures that focus on short-term gain and stifle dissent will tend to damage long-term growth and success. That same idea relates directly to creating long-term positive sleep habits. If our culture rewards and encourages limited sleep to get to school on time, finish homework, attend extracurriculars, etc., then teens will damage their positive sleep habits for short-term success and rewards. According to a podcast made by Dr. Matthew Walker, he says people who are typically sleeping less than 6 hours a night on average will have about 200% increased risk of heart attack in their lifetime. A 200% increase is a huge percentage to not take seriously and can be addressed by simply getting more sleep at night. One solution that has been recommended by many in the education space would be to change the hours of school to start later. Pushing back start times would give students an extra hour or two of sleep in the morning. At night, teens release melatonin way differently than young children and adults do, which affects their sleep schedule. Teens' brains start releasing melatonin about 3 hours later than adults and younger children's brains. State Representative John Ray Clemens, who advocates for later start times, said, when teens wake up early, their brains are still producing melatonin, so waking a teen at 7 a.m. is akin to waking one of us up at 4 a.m. There are limitations to the idea of a later start time for high school students. Many say it would be too expensive to change the school hours because it would cost too much to change the bus schedule. A school in suburban Memphis researched the feasibility of starting at a later time. Research concluded that busing costs associated with delayed start times could be as high as $1.4 million annually. That estimate assumed the district would need more drivers, more fuel and maintenance, more storage facilities, and additional support personnel. In addition to the high cost to maintain the buses needed for later start, some argue that the logistics of after-school and extracurricular activities would be too disruptive. My response to those limitations is high school is too critical of a learning time to not be maximizing time in school. In order to get the most out of our high school years, we should spend the money it takes to make learning possible. Yes, it may be more expensive to get teens to and from school, but the increased ability to concentrate, remember, and think analytically will be worth the additional expense. The potential cost savings on healthcare, loss of learning, and other expenses could make the cost of busing students a good investment. And there are schools like OPRF that do not require busing to and from schools, so the cost would not be a limitation in a district like ours.
All right, thank you, Molly. Okay. All righty. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple questions for oral defense.
Okay.
Let's see. What evidence did you gather that you didn't include, and why did you choose not to include it?
I had a lot of evidence on fear and anxiety caused by lack of sleep, but I chose not to include it because after researching more, I found that adults suffer from anxiety, fear and anxiety more than teens do. So I felt like it didn't really fit in my presentation.
Thank you. How is your conclusion in conversation with the body of literature or other research sources you examined?
Other sources I examined also had the same conclusions as me, so I wanted to further my research on what the benefits are of changing school start times and how that will impact teens.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hello, my name is William Harris, and this is my presentation about donations and how they can corrupt the morality of government. Starting off, it is common knowledge for quite some time that moral integrity is a requirement for government to function. Even Franklin Roosevelt knew this back in his day, saying in his inauguration that it's no small wonder that confidence languishes, for it can only thrive on honesty, on honor, on the sacredness of obligation, on faithful protection, and on unselfish performance. If a government were to act unmorally, it would likely crush every citizen underfoot on its way to selfish power and gain. According to Vedko Dublevic, every action can be judged on a moral scale based off of the ADC, standing for agent, deed, and consequence. And his research showed that although the other two were very important to the decision, what would ultimately push a person one way or the other on a judgment was the deed itself. So for example, if a soldier was forced to kill a civilian, like Ted Thomas mentioned they would in his paper about moral courage, many people would say even if it was for a good cause and it was a good man who committed the action itself was still wrong. Now, besides individual actions, government itself has a strict set of morals it must abide to. According to Robert Downey in his book, it must further the public interest, it must incentivize participation, and it must emphasize the pursuit of happiness. Now, unfortunately, the government is not meeting those requirements. Many forms of immorality exist in the government, but one of the most widespread and easy to uncover is corruption. According to Susan Rose Ackerman, this graph portrays corruption rates in 107 different countries, and it shows that in so many different government roles, people have been taking bribes and have been corrupt. But the problem is, in America, it's not a legal corruption. It's a very legal system that leads to it. This is how donations can cause corruption. Now, according to David Dewitt, during the COVID pandemic, the nursing home industry gave the Ohio state government $6.1 million in donations. And in return, the government would keep them open, even though there's a pandemic. As a result of this, so many senior citizens that were entrusted to the nursing home's care were put at high risk. $6.1 million was the cost of living. Here's my offered solution. The solution comes from Ian Ayres, who suggests that mandating anonymous donations through a system of blind trust might make it harder for candidates to sell access or influence because they would never know which donors would pay the price. Effectively, this is saying that in order to minimize any undue bias or obligation to anyone besides the public, governments should hide donor identities to the recipients of the donations. And while it's very true that it's widely agreed upon by political scientists that donations can cause corruption, where they tend to differ is their solution. Because besides privatizing all donor identities, even to recipients, the other most popular solution is to publicize all donors to every single citizen. And a good example of the success that a public donation can see comes from the Brennan Center for Justice, which shows that government is very successful when it implements a model of public funding that does not seek to end all private fundraising, but rather amplifies the impact of small gifts. So qualified candidates receive $6 in public funds for each $1 raised in small donations of $1.75 or less. This effectively makes politicians have to do so much more to work for public donations, and it makes them work for the greater good like a government is morally obligated to. But unfortunately, public exposures to corruption aren't always effective. And a good example of this is the case of Clarence Thomas. Because according to ProPublica, Clarence Thomas is a Supreme Court justice who is very friendly with a Republican billionaire donor named Harlan Crow. Crow very often gifts Thomas either trips to his personal resort or large amounts of money. And as such, Thomas will often make decisions that align with Harlan Crow's moral viewpoints. This is a textbook example of bias. And although the public is aware of his corruption, not much has happened. He still serves on the Supreme Court. This shows that public shame is what donations rely on in this case, and it's not working the right way. So in conclusion, if donations are truly the problem, the best way to prevent corruption is to interrupt any obligation or bias besides the one of the public before they have the chance to begin.
All right. Thank you for that. All right. Hard part's over. All right, here we go. How about this? We'll ask you a couple questions here. How did you use the conclusions or questions of others to advance your own research?
So Ian Ayres was the one who proposed the solution I ended up going with of privatizing all donor identities. And I saw that and I was very interested in it. So after I noticed that, I kind of looked at more pros and cons and just tried to examine all possible scenarios of implementing a system like that.
How did your research question evolve as you moved through the research process?
Oh, okay. When I first started off, I was purely examining whether or not, as a whole, government was acting morally or immorally. And that was a very, very broad subject. So I eventually focused on the fact that corruption was very common, And donations were a very common cause of corruption. So if my question started here, I kind of did everything I could to narrow it into something that I felt like made a lot of sense.
Thank you. Good. Okay, go ahead.
All right. So imagine yourself taking a big test. This could be an SAT test, an AP exam, or maybe even a bar exam. Your hands are shaking, your breath is fastening, but why is this? What if I told you it's not because you're actually scared of the test, but because your ancestors were scared of their predators tens of thousands of years ago? My name is Connor, and I'm focusing on instinctive fear in the modern world. So, as we all know, hunter-gatherer life was very different than the modern life we live today. People like them were constantly plagued by predators, the threat of starvation, and social isolation. And consequently, through evolution, we adapted to all these dangers over thousands and thousands of years. But now in the modern world, we no longer have all of these dangers threatening our lives. So that leaves the question, what happens to these leftover traits that are embedded within us after millions of years of evolution? Dr. Dean Mobbs, a neuroscience professor for Caltech, found that these traits leave us open to affective disorders like anxiety, uncertainty, and sensitivity. So it's clear that these genes have a lot of influence over our modern lives. But what exactly do these genes do to us? I believe that while these traits were certainly beneficial in previous millennia, they no longer retain their value in the modern world. In order to get a grasp of our problem, it's important to know just how much our environment has changed. Ecological biologist Juraj Bergman and his colleagues found that there was an almost 90% decrease in megafauna populations in the past 50,000 years. And because megafauna are the only animals big enough to be able to actually hunt humans, this essentially means there's a 90% decrease in the amount of predators that humans have. So, because our amount of predators has decreased so much, therefore our need for fear has decreased so much. But unfortunately, we know that while our environment has changed, we have not changed with it. Biologist J.B.S. Haldane, in his book on evolutionary theory, found that a racial change, as small as the pigmentation on your skin, takes at least 1,000 generations or 20,000 years. Now imagine how long it would take to evolve out of a trait as integral to your life as anxiety or fight or flight reactions. That would take 1 million, even 2 million years. So now we know that our need for fear has lessened, but our amount of fear has stayed the same. In ancient times, anxiety served as an extension of fear that helped with the complex social situations that our hunter-gatherer ancestors had to deal with. Because every hunter-gatherer knew that social isolation was almost certainly meant death. This meant that we needed to develop certain traits like anxiety to use our intelligence and deal with these threats of socialization so that we could stay within our tribe and not be ousted. But nowadays, this cooperation is much less necessary because the modern world almost guarantees our survival. Despite that, as previously established, these genes still very much affect us in the modern world. Clinical psychologist Jeffrey Mermelstein found that higher amounts of testing anxiety associate with lower intelligence. Now, in the modern world, the world is mainly focused around mental feats rather than physical feats. So this anxiety, it doesn't help us run away from predators, and it doesn't help us run away from predators because there are no predators, and it doesn't help us get any more intelligent because they actually lower our intelligence. This means that if it can't benefit our intelligence, it can't benefit our physical safety, it only strictly negatively impacts us in the modern world. Another feature of instinctive fear is humanity's fight or flight reaction, and it has effects similar to anxiety. So this is when you get an influx of panic and adrenaline coursing through your veins. That way it enables you to be able to run away from a bear or another ferocious predator, therefore letting you survive. But obviously in the modern world, these predators aren't hunting us anymore. So these situations where a bear might be hunting us have been replaced by watching a horror movie, which is equally scary to your mind, but obviously not nearly as threatening. Dr. Abhijit Suresh, a cognitive neuroscience researcher for the University of Colorado Boulder, found that the genuineness of the perceived threat is very important and may not be the same in different cases. So take public speaking, for example. You're not under any real risk, but your body thinks you are, which is why your fight or flight reaction gets enabled. You start to sweat, you start to get more nervous. But it's not just movies and public speaking that activate this intense reaction. In fact, the Gale Encyclopedia of Psychology found that the modern world puts us into a constant state of overdrive in which fight or flight reactions are continually and constantly activated. The modern world activates these responses even though there's almost never a threat serious enough that actually qualifies for a response like this. This means that we are now being forced under excess stress and excess pressure because of these fight or flight reactions. They're not actually benefiting us anymore because we don't have to run from predators, meaning that they strictly negatively impact us. Another instinctive part of fear embedded within humanity is trauma and how we react to traumatic situations. Fortunately, while the modern world may strip us of the benefits of traits like anxiety and fight or flight, it actually enables us to recover from traumatic events better. So hunter-gatherers every day, they could see their family get killed or starve to death. And then instead of being able to relax and cope with that traumatic situation, they had to go on with their everyday lives, continue hunting, continue farming in order to survive. Trauma-Informed Care in Behavioral Health Services, a government-sponsored book, found that people automatically reevaluate their values and redefine what is important after a traumatizing event. The modern world allows us to maximize this reevaluation. So instead of going back on the hunt or going back to the farm, we can go to the couch, watch a movie, or maybe go to the bar and spend some time with friends. Unfortunately, while the rehabilitation method is optimized by the modern world, trauma still leaves a much greater negative impact on us in the modern world than it did in the Paleolithic one. Biology professor Leanna Zenet and her colleagues conducted a study analyzing predator exposure and its effect on birds. They found that in the birds exposed to predators, the costs in terms of reduced quality of life were numerous and diverse, whereas the birds that weren't exposed to predators continued to feed and continued to socialize. Those that were refused to feed and refused to socialize, thus greatly diminishing their quality of life. If we cross this over to humans, we see that it's really quite similar. Take veterans, for example. They're not going to get redeployed into war, but they're still suffering from intense PTSD because they're scared it's going to happen again. They're illogically scared. Obviously, they know it's not going to happen again, but their body thinks it is because this instinctive fear isn't built for the modern world. That's why trauma also leaves a lasting negative impact on us in the modern world.
Oh, I'm sorry. I clicked over
Oh, that's okay.
because. Okay, go ahead.
Mental health disorders and complications were not a part of everyday life. They're unnecessary, unhelpful, and strictly negative, but because evolution works so slowly, we're still afflicted by these genes. Instincts like anxiety, fight or flight, and trauma, while integral to ancient life, now only bring forth negatives in the modern world.
Good. Excellent. Thank you for that. Because I didn't want it to beep and then I forgot to click back over. So sorry about that. Okay. So now I'll ask you your oral defense questions. Let's see. What information did you need that you weren't able to find or locate?
I needed a lot more information on trauma. I needed more information for my counter argument because the evidence that I collected was kind of vague. It just said that the modern world helps us with the reevaluation process, but it never actually gave any specific examples. It was kind of just one broad sentence.
Okay. What additional questions emerged from your research, and why are these questions important?
Yeah, well, I really wanted to focus on the more physical aspect, more being scared of predators and stuff, and I think I did that But I also am interested in the psychology, the social psychology behind a lot of these emotions. So one of the questions I would have is like, what are the social implications of anxiety and fight or flight reactions? Like, what do they actually do to you in terms of social situations?
All right. Thank you.